Hello, and welcome back to the 2020 Building the New World Conference. Tonight, we're going to be addressing Sector 2, which is Communications and Media. Our first presenter tonight is Ruth Broyde Sharone. Ruth is a journalist, filmmaker, and interfaith leader. She produced and directed the award-winning documentary, God and Allah Need to Talk. She also authored the interfaith memoir, Minefields and Miracles. She is a correspondent for the Interfaith Observer. She's worked at the Associated Press, the Italian Chronicle, and the Jerusalem Post. Since 2007, Ruth has served as co-chair of the Southern California Parliament of the World's Religions. Currently, she's composing Interfaith the Musical, based on her extensive experience in the interfaith community. Our other guest tonight is Yolanda Nava. She is an Emmy award-winning broadcast journalist and columnist. She's appeared on NBC, CBS, and PBS, as well as other national and local television stations. Yolanda was the first Mexican-American woman to found, own, and operate a TV station in the United States. And she was the first Latino reporter to appear on network news in Los Angeles. She also was voted Entertainer of the Year for hosting the nationally syndicated Hispanic TV show Latin Tempo. In addition, Yolanda is an award-winning author. Her book of Latino virtues is entitled It's All in the Frijoles. She currently is writing a very different sort of book, Through the Dark. It's a memoir centered on the sudden loss of her eyesight. Ladies, welcome, and we look forward to this presentation.
Thank you. We're delighted to be with you. Yolanda, I wanted to start by asking you, journalist to journalist, woman to woman, what was it like for you, not just being a Latina journalist, but being a woman operating in a man's world, which was primarily a man's world in journalism when we both started?
Yes, it was. And I was very fortunate because I came into television. I worked for KNBC hosting a show, and I was brought in by the executive producer, and of course the network suits. And but I was invited in to guest host a show on the changing roles of Chicana women, Mexican American women. And I didn't know I was being auditioned. I just thought I was appearing to talk about a subject that I was passionate about. I had founded a Comisión Femenil, a women's organization to empower Chicana Mexican American women. We used those terms back then. I was back in the early 70s. And I found KNBC was very receptive to me. There was some suggestion I change my name, but I chose not to do that. And nothing was ever said after that. And so my first experience was very positive. And while I was with KNBC, it was excellent. When I applied to go over to the news side, my co-host on the show, first show I did, was a male, Latino male. And when I applied, he, of course, got it because at that time they weren't looking at women much, and certainly not a Mexican-American woman. So he got that appointment. But I ended up having a longer career in broadcast than he did because I was good at what I did. And it was a different time. However, it was a man's world. And the doctor that wrote the foreword to the book Through the Dark that's forthcoming talked about coming up in a male-dominated world. It wasn't easy. My male co-host was difficult, and I had to deal with that. But on the whole, it wasn't. I didn't feel it. I was so busy doing what I had to do that only looking back do you say, "Oh my God, how did I get through that?"
Well,
you too, Ruth, had to deal with these things. You were in Israel, you were there for 10 years, and it was, also a man's world there on that side of the world. How were you treated by the men initially?
It was problematic, mostly not so much in journalism, but in filmmaking, in television. When I was trained to be a documentary filmmaker, and then when I wanted to get a job as a director, most of the men were just not interested, or they would make some derogatory remark. And I had even one government official ask me if I had a boyfriend when I went for an interview. And I said, well, what does that have to do with anything? And he said, well, if you have a boyfriend, then you don't need this job. So that was shocking. But, also having worked in the field for more than 40 years as a journalist, I did want to share with the audience a clip from a video that was filmed in Geneva at the UN 20 years ago. And just a short reflection on my part of the role of the journalists. Now, the audience there, they were journalists from all over the world, from countries, democratic countries, socialist countries, authoritarian countries. So I was not speaking to the choir, as you say, and I wasn't speaking just to my own colleagues from the United States, but it's just a 1-minute video, and I'd like to share it with everybody to think about what was current then and what is still very current and relevant now.
What is our responsibility as people of the press? Now, each one of us has a distinct filter through which we view the world, and there's nothing we can do about it. There's no truly neutral story or truly objective story. It's always through the eyes and ears of whoever it is that's covering the story. But still, we do have a responsibility to try to be as faithful to the events that happen, especially being here at the United Nations, where we have people who've come from so many different backgrounds and so many different experiences of journalism and media, that we still have to, as much as possible, to be scrupulous and vigilant about what it is that we are conveying. There must be some way that the media can also use that aspect of the filter for creating good in the world. So if members of the press are interested in peace in the world, and there's a way to write about a situation, not distorting the facts, but in a way that enhances the peacemaking process, I'm all for it.
The role of the journalist then, as now, is essential. And we have that obligation. I remember when I was first at KNBC, and then when I was reporting for KCET in LA, the public broadcast station, and went to Sacramento to report Capitol correspondent and anchor the news and report on the news up there. And we aired in 40 markets when I first worked for the cable station up there, and then I moved over to the CBS station. There was the obligation to be objective, to not interject your own personal opinions into the story, but to show all the different sides of the issue that was being presented at the time. And I think that was a very fine objective. And at the same time, there are ways that we can demonstrate compassion, for example. When I was covering AIDS and amnesty for the CBS station in Los Angeles, I would sit down on the bedside of a dying AIDS patient, and I would hold his hand when I was interviewing, or they were doing, I was talking to the gentleman, and to demonstrate that you couldn't catch AIDS by just being in somebody's presence. It was a body fluid to body fluid contact that was required, or using needles, hypodermic needles. And so there are things that you can do in terms of human compassion and response to a situation, but to remain, to not bombard the audience with your own personal opinion, as is done today, was considered vital then. And I think we need to distinguish between commentary and reportage today.
I wanted to talk about the concept of the fourth estate, which all journalists know about, but maybe the general public isn't as familiar with. The idea that in America, we know the founding fathers were very interested in checks and balances. And so aside from the executive branch, the judicial branch, and Congress, the fourth estate, which is the press, was considered absolutely vital for the sustaining a democracy. And I looked up, I just wanted to see how the fourth estate is described in Wikipedia. And I thought this was such an interesting definition. It says the fourth estate refers to the press and news media, both in explicit capacity of advocacy and implicit capacity to frame public issues. the fourth estate provides a public check on the branches of government. And we've seen, just as we're watching what's happening around the world, in any country in which that was previously a democratic country and is moving towards authoritarianism, the very first thing the head of that country will do is squelch the press or take over the press, take over the cameras, the internet, and so forth, so that there is no ability to report on what's actually happening. And when that happens, you know that country is on the downfall. If you just say one thing about a country, that there's no longer a free press, then we know that democracy is in jeopardy. However, and I want to get your idea about this, Yolanda, we are very polarized in America now. And so it seems everybody has chosen up sides, as they do in the baseball games when they decide who's going to be on what team. And so it's very difficult to find sources of news which are, according to the standard that you laid out and that I learned in journalism school at Medill School of Journalism, the gold standard of trying to remain objective. So what news source do you trust, Yolanda? How do you know where to go in order to make sure you're getting something that's real and accurate and not just someone's personal idea of what should be happening?
Well, part of it is looking at different stations, looking at different, print media, looking for investigative journalism, for example, that, extends the story out more broadly than you might see in local newspapers, the New York Times and Washington Post. I bounce around between MSNBC, CNN, CBS, PBS. The evening news hour on PBS has become quite good with Judy Woodruff. She's an oldie but goodie, but she's there. And looking at that, I look at Fox News to see what's going on there, because they really drove the last election and created the man who's in the presidency today. And maybe they're happy or not happy with that at this point. We'll see what happens in the next, coming weeks and where they go. But it's challenging because there's so much opinion now just thrown around, and there isn't a connecting of the dots. I think we need to view the media, the information, with discerning eyes. And I remember when I was staying with a friend when I first moved here to the desert up in La Quinta, and we would watch the news cycle, and it was Romney and Obama at that time. And I'm blind and I can't see, but I felt that Romney was not being truthful. And I felt he was nervous because you could hear it in his voice. There was just not a solidity to it. And the next day, the commentator, and I asked my friend, I said, Shelley, I said, is he sweating? Is he perspiring? And she said, no. And then the next morning, the commentators were remarking on the fact that he was, profusely perspiring. And I said, see, I told you, I knew that he was in the midst of a falsehood, if not a lie. So I think we have to come to the media, the news, not only with our preferences and priorities, but with a sense of internal discernment that has to be developed, kind of a gut response. Is this true or is this false? Especially today, we have to distinguish between those things. What feels right? Is this humane? What are the values behind it? Is it hateful? Is it loving? Is it, all those other aspects of what character and integrity and those kind of issues used to represent. It's challenging. And as well as I do that it has shifted dramatically over the recent decades. And when I think some degree of deliberation to deconstruct the principles by which we used to operate. What do you think?
Well, like you, I skim a lot. I go back and forth, and I always make sure I go to conservative radio as well as National Public Radio. I feel an obligation to listen, and not to listen with a critical ear, but to listen to what they are saying as their truth. And I learned many years ago from my father, who was one of the most honest people I know, when he was having difficulty with people who were totally opposed to him, and he was a teacher in the public school education in Chicago. And when I found out what they said, that they wanted to get him fired because he was calling them to task for having such low standards of pedagogical standards, and he actually foresaw what happened to our educational system. And that was in the 50s, you know, he saw it coming, but nobody wanted to listen to him. And so he was confronted with the idea that he might lose his job. And he talked to the people who wanted to fire him. And I asked him later, I said, Dad, don't you just hate them for what they're doing to you in your life? And you know what he said to me? He said, no, why would I hate them? They are sincere men. And I've always tried to remember that when I confront someone who has such a divergent view than I do about the world, and I have to say that I have many friends who are wedded to the Republican Party and will continue to vote Republican. And I find that to be able to create a space of respectful and genuine listening, not already knowing what you're going to say back to them when they finish, but just really listening to people, is really at the heart of what I would call one of the first rules of communication in building the new world. If we don't develop that listening ability, we're not going to be building a new world. We're just going to be continuing the same old world. Yes, what were you going to say, Yolanda?
Listening is really critical. And also having some basics about democracy and democratic ideals. Have people read the Bill of Rights? Immigrants have to read the Bill of Rights and the Constitution as part of their becoming U.S. citizens. And those celebrations, those when they are given the citizenship, they're very meaningful and very powerful experiences. I had to cover some of those during the amnesty era, and beyond. There's some basics that we don't really learn. I remember my high school government teacher, Mr. Scott. I went to an excellent high school, John Marshall in Los Feliz, and he told us that right and left aren't opposite ends. You know, one arm's out this way, one arm's the other way. Aren't opposite ends of a linear scale. They meet. And he put his arms in front of himself, and he says, you know, where the figures meet is totalitarianism. So they're not opposites, but they do meet at a point, and both are totalitarian. Fascism and communism meet at totalitarianism. And I remember that all these decades, and it becomes even more significant today because of what we're seeing. Democrats are being accused of being communists and anarchists, which, you know, that's certainly not my label. And yet who's playing footsie with the leader of the communist world, which is a totalitarian state where they kill opposition leaders. You know, this you could talk more about some of the journalists that are being knocked off, but it's frightening to see this, and that people don't understand what the politics of some of the leaders that are being touted as friends who they really are, and the kind of brutal governments that regimes that they head.
Well, I wanted to talk, you were mentioning about immediately getting rid of the top journalists, finding a way to eliminate them, either by mysterious deaths or by maybe poisoning, or as we know in the case of the Turkish journalist who was killed, Khashoggi was killed by the Saudis. And I don't think when we started out in journalism, we were thinking of it as a dangerous profession. But over the decades, I've come to appreciate that you have to be really, it's not just about being trained as a journalist, caring about the world, wanting to be a reporter. You have to have a certain kind of willingness to encounter the unknown and the dangerous unknown. And maybe that's where the reputation of the journalists came from, and that is always portrayed in the movies, that the people go to the most dangerous parts on earth, but they're willing, even the killing fields, they're willing to stay behind and be at personal risk, because the idea of conveying the news, and in many cases the violence and the carnage and what is happening that people around the world would never know if it weren't for those journals, becomes so important to them that they do risk their lives. And I just wonder how many people in the public arena are cognizant of the danger element of what it means to be a journalist working the globe today.
Well, again, in the past, if you were in a war zone, yes. Excuse me, if you were in a war zone, you ran into those kind of problems, and there was that risk. However, for many of the journalists, and I'm thinking women journalists, because there was a group, the International Women's Media Organization, which I was a member of when I was reporting, would hold events, luncheons, to honor the women leaders, the women reporters who were putting their lives on the line, who had either been threatened or maimed or beaten or, in some way brutalized in their countries when they were attempting to expose corruption or malfeasance of any kind. And it was a very powerful group. And when you heard the stories of some of these women reporters, as these are women, and what they went through in order to pursue the story and to try to bring awareness of justice and democracy to their countries and to the public was heart-rending and very emotionally wrenching, because at that time, and I'm looking at 30 years ago, 40 years ago, when all this was going on, it was a different time, and it was such a contrast to what was going on in our country, because we felt relatively safe. 50 years ago,
a delusion.
Yes, 50 years ago, a very prominent Mexican-American journalist, Ruben Salazar, was killed during the Chicano moratorium, which was an anti-Vietnam War march and rally. And it was peaceful. It was meant to be peaceful. Turned out not to be. But that's another story. We could talk about that later or another time. But he had been threatened periodically. He was working for the LA Times. He was also working for the Spanish language television station as news director and also commentator. And he was warned. The police went to him and said, we don't want you reporting on police brutality. And this was 50 years ago. We know what's happening now and all that's going on. But at that time, he was threatened, and he was killed that day. And there were no charges brought against the sheriff's officer who fired a weapon that was designed to go through a block wall through a cloth curtain. And it hit him on the left temple, went out through the right temple, and of course killed him. That's a perfect aim. And so it's even though it was allegedly shot through a cloth curtain, but I understood that the person peeked under the curtain right before he fired, and so nobody talks about that, but that's what happened. He knew where the gentleman was sitting.
Yolanda, do you think that deters people from becoming journalists? Do you think that aspect of danger is a deterrent, or could it somehow be actually an aphrodisiac? To want to work.
I don't think it's an aphrodisiac. I think we put those things behind us. That there were no charges filed. People forget very quickly in this country. That was 50 years ago. But today, I understand, there was just a report I got something from KCRW radio in Los Angeles. I live in the desert, so I don't hear it here necessarily. But that there was a Latino journalist that was shot by a police officer when he was covering a demonstration in Long Beach. So there are because journalists are being attacked from the top, they are now vulnerable to individuals and people out of the streets. It is threatening. It can be. And the trouble with that is that it can put a pall over one's sense of freedom to be able to act out. I mean, to be able to speak out. And because of the way people do act out, to counter that, people are beating people up, they're killing them. And so it's very frightening. And this is where the courage comes in. And this is where that total commitment to the right, to the good, to the higher minded principles that we say we believe in: liberty, justice, and equality for all, and freedom of the press. And these are vital things that they're very frail. Democracy is a frail thing. It's not permanent unless we protect it.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, but I was just thinking about how things have changed during our lifetime as journalists. And nowadays, there are other sources of news that didn't exist before. There is the internet, right? There are the private telephones of people on the street filming at any given moment what's going on, and which now those cameras and that footage is actually used to prosecute people in criminal acts. And not only that, but on the internet itself, there are all these different channels. There's YouTube and there's Twitter, and there's all the different news sources, which I would also question how objective they are. I think the people behind those sources also have an agenda. So it's really, truly difficult to find an objective source today. But I think part of what we end up doing, and I hear you do the same thing, is that we create our own objectivity by going back and forth, by scanning, by piecing together, so that there is not one place where we could go and say, they speak for me and they represent the kind of news I want to get. But Laura and Stephen pointed out to me, I didn't know about this, but there's something called Vice News. And we thought we'd play a little snippet of it to show what a new way of approaching the news is. And perhaps this is what will define the communications and media in the new world. So Stephen, would you play some of that clip for us? Mm-hmm. We're not hearing any sound, Stephen. Stephen, we're not hearing sound. So maybe you want to come back to us and work on that, and then we'll come back to the clip in a moment.
Well, these are interesting things. I mean, when you have so many alternative places, we have to look at, again, the thought behind. Just like you have a group, well, you could go off into politics. People call themselves something that sounds wonderful, Citizens United, and yet that is an entity that is, quietly destroying our democracy. And we have to look at just more than an interesting name or a title or what is presumed to be, and we have to look behind who are the players that are behind these different media organizations. And
you know what they say, follow the money.
Well, this is absolutely right. That's all we have to do with who, and but that story won't happen until the state court can take it up in New York. It's challenging because our procedures and protocols are they're elaborate, and yet they're not. There are ways to circumvent, and people have found ways to do that. And I think they started that back in I remember it was back in the late 90s or late 80s and maybe 90s when they started this shock jock stuff. And it was so rude and ugly and nasty. And that was the beginning of what we're seeing today and what happened in the 2016 election, where you could get away with talking, in a vile, hateful, horrible way and attacking people in the process very viciously. There's one thing to take on an issue, but to do personal attacks based on people's ability or disability or political point of view, or because they stand up against you or something that you believe in, and take them down in general, like taking down McCain, attempting to. You can't. He was a prisoner of war and a very courageous and honorable congressman. But there's a lot to work through, as you know.
Yeah, I wanted to point something out, though, that most people don't know, is that if you go back to the really early newspapers of our republic at the time the United States was formed, you will find some of the most vicious condemnations and attacks among the opposite parties, that we think that this is just something that was invented today or that we became specialists in it. But if you go back and look at some of the cartoons that were drawn at the time and what was publicly pronounced against the opponents, you realize that this actually is part of human nature, and that each generation decides whether they want to promote an aspect of human nature, which gets involved in name calling and beyond that. I think what bothers me about today, Yolanda, and I don't know, I'd like to hear what you think about it too, is that I remember growing up with Walter Cronkite.
Yes.
I remember he had this aura of not just wisdom and experience and breadth of understanding, a well-educated person who had studied the world, studied history. And so when he spoke with a gravitas that he earned, not because he thought he was important, but people trusted him. And little by little, that's been chiseled away. And especially in the current administration, I think that journalists are often ignored, and if a journalist isn't particularly liked or asks pointed or embarrassing questions, that journalist doesn't get to ask the question. So there's something about, again, coming back to the original point we started with, the fourth estate, that if there isn't a hallowed attitude towards what the fourth estate represents and how it helps keep everything else running smoothly, it's kind of the oil. It's the oil in the wheels and the grid through journalism that helps government monitor itself and helps the different branches of government have a healthy attitude towards each other, because they know that the press is independent. So we've seen such a big shift in that, and it's very worrisome. And I try to think of, is there any one journalist today that I could say is equivalent of Walter Cronkite? And I really am hard pressed to think of someone. What about you?
Well, I won't go there. We both agree on Walter Cronkite, and I'm not seeing them, and that part of it is the seeing and the gravitas, and the whole package that you get together. And it's interesting because I worked for CBS when Cronkite was there. We used to go back. The talent used to go. The anchors and reporters used to go back to Black Rock and meet with the staff, the Bob Schiefers, the Walter Crankites, the staff that there, Leslie Stahl. I got to meet Leslie Stahl.
Yeah.
We were both pregnant at the same time. She's wonderful. And then I got to interview her when she wrote her memoir back in the late 90s. I interviewed her, and that's on my website. And she's wonderful, and she still is working now for 60 Minutes. But this shift, you were talking about the attacks that went on in the local newspapers, way back when, yellow journalism, they called it. I consulted the Christian Science organization and worked with a publishing society, and I served on the Mary Baker Eddy Library for the Betterment of Humanities advisory board that helped shape that library, which is a beautiful concept. And her motto for the Christian Science Monitor newspaper, which was founded about more than 100 years ago, probably the first decade of the last century, was to injure no man, but to bless all mankind. And I think if we had that kind of purpose and mission at every level of print and media and social media, that would carry us a long way in covering issues in a way that would be dignified and clear and seek to bring forth the truth, not to bury it, but to reveal what we need to see in order to keep our democracy.
So, Mary Baker Eddy, where are you when we need you?
Well,
I mean, like,
the writers are still present.
Such a beautiful quote, but you know, like, who could you imagine saying that today?
Yeah, yeah. And you know why she did that? Because she was a woman who spoke before 10,000 people. She founded a church, a metaphysical college, a publishing society, the Christian Science Monitor, and she was very high-minded and very successful as a woman at a time when she's a Victorian era woman. And they went after her in Boston, and probably elsewhere, but especially in Boston, because that's where her home was. And so she said, I'm under attack by yellow journalism. And so she started her own newspaper and did it with very high-minded standards. And it's been a very successful, publication. Now it's changing over time. And a lot of the print media is being threatened because financially it's not as viable as it once was because of all the alternative forms of journalism that exist that are cheap.
But you're right, because the Christian Science Monitor was a gold standard for journalism for many, many, many decades. And she created that. That was at the core of her philosophy. And so that permeated out into the way they reported too. But, I wanted to bring something else up because I know this was something we discussed before this session that we felt was really significant in going into building the new world, about the training of journalists. So I'd like you to talk about that a little, and then I'd like to share a story as well. Go ahead. Would you tell us?
I think the training for journalism is very important. And the mindset that a journalist brings to that training and to that experience, I must say, I have not had one single journalism class. I came in and jumped in and was honored to be able to do it and saw how other people did it. And learned from them and develop my own approach to it. And of course, I work from the principles. If I were to train, and I think I had an advantage because as a bicultural woman, I've always seen myself as a bridge builder, and having the ability to dance between two different cultures, two different languages across my life. To have dealt with sexism and racism has opened me to a lot that maybe other people haven't been exposed to or aware of because they've never experienced it and can't relate to it. And so when I see, a Black Lives Matter protest, I don't automatically think they're the bad guys. And when there is some violence there, I don't automatically think it's one of the people in the group that has agitated that violence, created that violence for the purpose of engendering animosity towards the group. That was done during the Chicano moratorium back in 1970 that I was referring to with regard to Ruben Salazar. So the training is also a training it should be a training that involves comparative religion, philosophy, that involves cross-cultural awareness, looking at different cultural, ethnic, racial groups in our own country, and having a sense of comparative religion, because look at the anti-Islam attitudes that we have in this country. And it is a beautiful faith. It's a very spiritual faith. And if you read about it, that's understood. And there's common ground between the people of the book, between the the sons of Abraham. And you have Islam, and you have Jews, and you have Christians, and all people of the book love God, Allah, Yahweh, do good, be good. How hard is that? So we have to learn more about different cultures and different groups that are owned in order to cover things with a sense of objectivity and compassion.
So I want to share a personal story that after I graduated from journalism, I had arranged to make a grand tour of Latin America. And I was there for a year and a half. I was working as a freelance journalist, earning pennies per word. And I was in 19 countries and 54 cities. I was gone for 18 months. And when I came back, I went to New York and I worked for one of the biggest news agencies around. They hired me. They gave me a journalism test and then they hired me. They didn't ask about my experience abroad, but they just, as long as I could pass the basic journalism test, they hired me. And one of my colleagues in the newsroom, where we wrote headlines and stories for radio and TV announcers across America, one of my colleagues, who was about my age, which was my early 20s when I would say, when he heard that I had been in Latin America for a year and a half, this is what he said to me. What? Who'd want to spend a year and a half with a bunch of Puerto Ricans? And I looked at him and I don't think I even answered. I was so floored that this man who was writing news summaries for radio and TV announcers across America, that afterwards those summaries were going to the rest of the world, would consider my trip in 19 countries, 54 cities, as if I had been living in Puerto Rico for 18 months.
Well, Puerto Rico's in the Caribbean, and that's part of the Latin world, but it's a separate, separate from Mexico, Central America, and South America.
You talk about the training and preparation for a job as important as the dissemination, the creation, not the creation, but the reporting and dissemination of news. I was floored. Yeah. And I'm going to mention something else, because as a Jewish woman, and because many times I worked at places where people did not know I was Jewish, it didn't come up, so I didn't share it. One of the other people in that same newsroom once said to me, "Too bad Hitler didn't finish the job when he had a chance."
It's terrible. Yeah.
And so I was, I thought, do I really want to be associated with people like this? Are these going to be my fellow journalists? And I ended up leaving and going to Europe and becoming a filmmaker. And then I worked in journalism in Italy and in Israel, and then back here again. And I was so, one of the things that traumatized me as well was when I was in Washington, D.C., at the Brookings Institute. They have sessions once a month to introduce the young people of Washington who work in the government offices to all different cultures and ideas and people who have a world experience. And the person who spoke the day I was invited to the luncheon was the head of Al Jazeera. You remember that was for a while the preeminent news agency in the Middle East.
Right. And
so I asked him, and he was from Pakistan originally, and I asked him, how are the journalists trained in Asia, in Pakistan, and the Middle East? And he said, oh, they're not trained. I said, well, how do they learn what they're supposed to do? He said, well, usually they have an uncle who's an editor and they decide they want to be a journalist.
Yeah.
And I said, how is that possible that there's not only no standard, but no process of acculturation or preparation? Now, you didn't go to journalism school and you learned a lot on the job, but you were a person, as you mentioned, you were multicultural, you spoke more than one language, you had an idea about world history. But if you can imagine in those countries that the news that's reaching millions of people, is coming from someone whose uncle was an editor and they decided, oh, I don't want to be a journalist. And that's how they get their news. So in the new world that we're going to build, you and I, Yolanda, in the new world we're going to build in communications and media, we are going to make sure that there are criteria for becoming a journalist. And I would even say that I would require a year of some kind of travel abroad or some other activity other than just going to school before someone could become a journalist. I think that that's
away from this country so that you'd have a greater appreciation for our democratic values, possibly. But to have, books to Kill the Mockingbird, there's so many different books that give you a sense of, from the inside of different peoples and cultures. And I think that's really important because our, and alternative history, not alternative, but the full history, the heartbeat of Wounded Knee, talking about, the extermination of Native Americans, indigenous people in this continent, 1491. There are so many different perspectives that can be brought to the table, which help us understand better what's going on today. The border issues, the why people are migrating from Central America to the border and seeking asylum, because a couple of decades ago we supported the generals in Honduras and Central America, Nicaragua and El Salvador, and now those countries are run by drug cartels and gangsters, and so the food is even short. There's not enough food to eat because they can't produce there because everything has been so wasted. There are cycles, and we don't know that we had a factor in that, and we have a responsibility that.
The interconnectedness of world events, that very often we're just looking at one thing and deciding on the basis of it what should be done when we have no idea of what came before.
Yeah.
I was wondering whether Stephen, we're coming pretty close to the end of our time before we take questions. Stephen, can you try that one more time? Share the...
What makes the desert so amazing and special to me is there's no place else like it that is so large and so vast, and also contains a tremendous amount of biodiversity as well. It would take about 100 years for this to recover, if it recovers at all.
An August lightning strike sparked a fire that scorched 43,000 acres in the world's largest Joshua Tree woodland, incinerating thousands of years of habitat within days.
This looks like night and day. I mean, huge difference between what's on our left and what's on our right.
Right, you can really see what was consumed. The larger, more robust cactus and Mojave yucca and Joshua tree, they were so badly scorched that the living tissue inside them literally boiled, and so most of them have died. The intensity of this fire and its size is pretty unprecedented in our time, and we're very concerned about that.
How unprecedented?
Well, I'm not aware of any fire since fire has been recorded in this area that was this extensive and this intense.
The trees lost in the Mojave Desert were eastern Joshua trees, one of two types of the iconic species. But it's the western Joshua tree, which grows across a more limited territory, that's at the center of a conservation fight. The western Joshua tree was denied federal protections in 2019, but a petition currently under state consideration would give it protections under California's Endangered Species Act. If approved, it would be the first time a plant or animal was added to the list, citing climate change as a main threat. Brendan Cummings authored the petition.
If you look at Joshua trees as a single entity, they're spread across 4 states, pretty wide area. And if you look at the western species in particular, which is what we have here in Joshua tree, their fate becomes much more tenuous. And that's for several reasons. 1, they occupy some of the hotter areas. 2, much of their habitat is on private land that's not protected from development. And if we don't do anything about our emissions and otherwise intervene, we're likely to lose them in the coming decades.
What is the scale of the loss?
Even if we could magically freeze climate change at current levels, we lose half their range. And at business as usual scenarios, we essentially lose all of them.
Protecting the western Joshua tree by classifying it as a threatened species is facing pushback from a surprising opponent, the renewable energy industry. It says the label could make it more difficult for California to meet its goal to have 100% carbon-free energy sources by 2045.
The California desert has really high solar insolation, or something called solar radiance. And when you look at the solar radiance intensity in the whole planet, the 2 most intense places are the California desert and North Africa. Our grid capacity needs to be expanded by numbers that are almost unimaginable. We're just at the very leading edge of figuring this out. And so to take huge swaths of the desert and set them off limits to solar development now, before we really know where they need to go, isn't appropriate.
Some shovel-ready solar projects share land with western Joshua trees, so industry executives say endangered species protections would throw those projects into question. They also worry about the precedent the listing could set.
I think we're in a situation now where we need to rethink how we do renewable energy planning and how we do conservation planning. Everything is being impacted profoundly right now, and I actually think we need to put a pause on listing the Joshua tree.
The renewable energy companies would argue that, look, all of these species are going to be lost eventually if they aren't able to work quickly to jumpstart these projects. And any sort of onerous permitting might throw off their timelines or would throw off their timelines. So what do you say to that?
Obviously, we need to get to 100% renewables as soon as possible. First place we should be doing it is on our rooftops. We need to be covering our parking lots. We need to perhaps be covering our roadways. There's so many places we can build it before we need to put it on intact lands in the desert. So this listing will not block solar projects in the desert, but it'll steer them away from that limited portion of the desert where we currently have Joshua trees.
This is amazing. This is really objective journalism at its best. I heard both sides, and it's up to me to decide what I want to think about it. I didn't feel the journalist, the reporter, was leaning to either side. She was just presenting the facts. Did you feel that too?
I think it was very, very well done, and what it called to mind to me, because I should have been an arbitrator or a solution maker. Because I could weigh and see the sides, and immediately I think there you have to bring the different forces together to the table, to put everything on the table, to work through, to hammer out how is this going to work for what we're trying to accomplish in terms of having alternative solar energy, et cetera, and how we're going to preserve different species. And it can be done when you bring the groups together to talk. My children's father was a legislator in Sacramento, and he served on the health committees in both the House and the Senate. And he was doing Medi-Cal reform. And I said, why can't you just do this, this, and this? Because I did a 5-part series on the high cost of healthcare when I was a journalist in Sacramento. And he said, Yolanda, if I put it all through at once, they're going to kill it. And he says, I have to chip away at it bit by bit. It took him about 10 years to accomplish all of the reforms that were required to really have a reform package. And it's a process. We don't have 10 years to deal with these things today. We have, really critical needs in terms especially of climate change. And so there has to be an escalation of the way that we bring stakeholders together to hammer out the differences and make it work, make it a win-win across the board.
Well, we're just about nearing the end of the time, and what you just said now is a reflection of what Rianne Eisler said on the opening night of the conference about the partnering that is absolutely crucial. And I wanted to share with everybody a song from the musical This Is Who We Are, and this is called, the name of the song is We Are the Ones We've Been Waiting For. And what's remarkable about that in terms of this conference is that song was written a while ago, but when the other keynote speaker, David Corton, spoke on the opening night, after this brilliant talk, he ended with one sentence, and this is the sentence he used. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Here's the song.
We have been waiting, anticipating. Will the one special one come today? We have been hoping, but barely coping in a world that's gone astray. And what if the one special one never comes? And what if we discover that we ourselves are the ones we have been waiting for. Not just you and me, but everyone, not just he and she, but everyone, not just they and them, but everyone together. Not just here and there, but everywhere, not just near and far, but everywhere, not just where we are, but everywhere together. Not just now and then, but all the time, not just if and when, but all the time, not just if we can, but all the time together. We are the ones we've been waiting for, all of us together. Everyone, everywhere, all the time, everyone, everywhere, all the time, everyone, everywhere, all the time. We are the ones we've been waiting for. Not just you and me, but everyone, not just he and she, but everyone, not just they and them, but everyone together. Not just here and there, but everywhere, not just near and far, but everywhere, not just where we are, but everywhere together. Not just now and then, but all the time, not just if and when, but all the time, not just if we can, but all the time together. We are the ones we've been waiting for, all of us together. Everyone, everywhere, all the time, everyone, everywhere, all the time, everyone, everywhere, all the time. We are the ones we've been waiting for, all of us together. We are the ones, we are the ones, we are the ones we've been waiting for.
Beautiful. I like to think of a lot of people are feeling very confused right now. These are challenging times. They're confused, they're angry, they're hurting. And I like to look at what Joan Baez said a long time ago, that action is the antidote to despair. And that we are the ones, in the sense of building the greater tomorrow, the new tomorrow. It's happening right now because we have to look at what gifts we have and what we have, what is ours to do. We have to all ask ourselves that question and move forward from that place and see the manifestation, the vision of a new world in a different way, specifically the good that we want to see in that world. And by visioning it and by stepping into it and taking action today, we bring it about.
Amen.
Well, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation, and we're very grateful that you've not only, I think, summarized the problems on the ground with the current media climate, but also you've given us some really good advice and hope for the future. So we're going to go into the Q&A and see what our audience would like to ask you to. The first question is, our future depends on knowing the reality on the ground and then strategically collaborating on building the new world. What can we do, those of us who are not journalists, to identify and share valid and trustworthy news?
You have to read across it. You have to read and look and see and listen across diverse presentations. But there are some trusted ones, and those are good places to go. And just, I would say, beware of the social media, because while there's good information there, there's just a lot of opinion and nonsense. And we don't need any more of that. We need to really deal with facts and look at trusted reporting, investigative journalism, and look for answers there. But I think the key word, I think what I really liked about the opening night, it was a beautiful opening night. The prayers were beautiful, but the strategic ideas that were put forth are things we can all get behind, and we can pick which part of that can we step into and carry forward. And everybody has a role, and whatever the inner divine impulse is to do, that is yours to do. You know, those, all of you in the audience, it is yours to do which you feel compelled to do.
That's beautiful. I wanted to add something to that too, is that you know, we also had the Russian bots to contend with too. I mean, we can't go to the internet and expect that we're going to get the truth of what's happening in the world from our internet today. It would be wonderful. And some people have stopped reading newspapers and have stopped reading books even, and have stopped accessing even television stations and cable stations because they think that they can get everything from the internet. And I think that would be a huge mistake. So what that really means, in answer to that question, that's such a good question, but I almost want to say to the person who asked it, what you're really asking is, what is your responsibility in seeking out accurate news? Because it's not going to be delivered on a silver platter to anybody. We all are in a situation now of questioning news sources, of trying to get it right, of trying to understand motivation behind certain announcements and the slanting of news. Mm-hmm. So it's not an easy job, but I remember after the elections when so many people, you remember there was this huge march, the Women's March, and people were so upset and people were grieving because they thought it would mark the end of the time that Roe versus Wade would be withdrawn, and that the environment would be impacted. And it's true, a lot of things have changed, but someone at the time said, when asked, what should we do? The answer was everything, like the song, everything, everywhere, all the time. We have to empower ourselves to find out what's true and what's real. And it's not an easy job, but I think that we've seen a huge awakening among our population, a keener interest, a keener desire to be masters of our own fate and to really find out what's happening and support the beautiful causes and principles which made this country possible. So the answer is work harder and know that there are other people who are feeling the same way and who also will join you in that effort.
There are many levels to do it. There was a film called A Year of Living Dangerously many years ago. Kevin Costner, and I forget the person who won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor, but it was took place in the revolution in Indonesia. And the photographer, who was a very compassionate, sensitive human being who saw everything as a photographer, asked the question, what can we do? What can we do? And the answer was to love whoever comes across our path. And I think the key to a lot of what's going on, the counter to hate and violence, is love and peacemaking. And I think that if love will trump hate any day. And we have to think more along those lines and bring that love and passion into the daily work that we do, because that will fuel us to bring about the changes that this organization wants to bring about and has put forward.
But for me, the most important part of all this is that we can't be passive.
Right.
That now this is a time when we can't just let everybody else take care of it. It's not it's not appropriate any longer to just be coasting on what were some really good times and a successful stock market and high job numbers. No, it's way beyond that. It's like it's a daily thing you do for yourself, for your family, for your community, for your country, where you are an active and proactive participant. The days of passivity are over forever. Thank goodness.
Hear, hear. Do we have other questions?
Yes, the next question is it true that only 5 media companies control the vast majority of our news?
Probably. I don't know how many, but yeah, it's they have conglomerated a lot. Some of the radio stations were put into a group. They're now 750 that form a radio group. I don't know who owns that. I've never investigated it, but I would think we could look at that. And we have to go. Who are on the boards of these groups? What are their mission statements and intentions? I think that's how we can evaluate, by looking at the mission statement, intentions, and actually what they do, not what they say.
And also, I want to point to a platform called London Real. It's Brian Rose was taken down from YouTube and from almost Twitter, from almost everything, because he was sharing information which the main media sources didn't want other people to hear, even to question, to be able to listen to it, to question. So he raised money, and he had some 25,000 followers around the world, and they created their own digital platform so that he could continue to broadcast that information. So it seems like, especially now, that is possible for people who can galvanize those kind of funds, bring together funds and start their own independent news source. That's amazing. Not everybody can do that, but the point is it's possible today where it wasn't.
So our next question, I think sort of is a tag along to the Vice News segment that we watch, because I know my kids are watching Vice News. So this question is, are millennials news junkies like earlier generations? Where are younger people getting their news?
I asked my son that because, he's also skeptical about the official news sources. And I say, where do you get your information, and how do you know it's accurate? And he said, I do a lot of research. I'm going to all different places all the time and looking at what's written and comparing it. So again, it brings back the idea of not being passive, that you just won't have something delivered to your doorstep, which tells you everything about the world, and then you don't have to think about it any longer. I think it's just a combination of looking around and checking and also getting feedback from your own friends. And the other thing is that if you can see something happening in your community and then someone writes about it and you see that it's not accurate, or that it's exaggerated, or that it's weighted in one direction, then that news source cannot be fully trusted. So again, we're thrown back onto our own efforts and abilities. And there are a lot of really intelligent people in our country who have been kind of slothful until now and who are waking up. And so I think that I can't give you one answer for where I would go to. I just know that I'm regularly moving back and forth between channels and stations and publications, and I'm just feeding myself until I can come to some idea of what I think is real and true. And that will vary even with people who may have similar worldviews. You may not find someone who feels exactly the way you do in your own group. So, and that's okay. And that's okay. We were designed for diversity and to have diverse thoughts. And as long as, like Rianne said, as long as we are engaging in the new kind of partnerships of collaboration, of equality among the sexes, and that we're designing a society in which everyone has an equal share, I think we'll be fine. It's just, these are the labor pains. And labor pains, as anybody who's had a child out there knows, they're painful. And sometimes when you're going through them, you're saying to yourself, why did I decide to do this? And I don't think I'll ever have another child again. And those same people have 2, 3, 4, 5 children again. So it's just recognizing the difficulty of this period and not losing heart.
And acting, stepping into what you feel called to do. Not standing back and being confused and just sitting there like the Senate did with the impeachment. Just sat back, watched, and didn't do their constitutional duty. So we all have to step it up.
So another viewer has asked, how do we go about reestablishing journalistic integrity in a culture of fake news, where there is the tendency to be unwilling to look outside of one's own echo chamber, social bubble, or comfort zone? She also says the concept of weighing sources and fact-checking is written off by many as some sort of liberal conspiracy.
I would never write it off. I think that, are you okay with my going first, Yolanda?
Go ahead.
Okay.
No, go ahead.
I think the fact that you understand that there's fake news and that you understand that to ferret out the truth is going to take effort is the first step. I mean, to simply accept everything you hear from the source that you've come to rely on and never question it is fallacious reasoning and dangerous reasoning. Because just like, I'll just put it to you in a very personal way. When you have siblings, 2 children who are arguing and you ask them what happened and you get 2 different stories about what really happened. And then you have to figure out from hearing both sides, how much of it is true, how much of it is fake news, and the discernment that it takes even for your own children is great, because you also need to know, is one of the children older than the other? Is the other one afraid of this? So it's not like you're just hearing information and making a decision of which direction to go. But I know in some families when that happens, rather than decide whose fault it was, who's to blame, they simply say to the children, well, you obviously have a problem here. I'm going to give you an opportunity to work it out. And so you teach them, you model for them what you do when you have conflicting information, when both sides think that they're the righteous side. But then again, it comes back to what the partnering and the new kind of communication where you're looking for solutions. And so, but I wouldn't be totally disheartened by the idea of fake news, because this is just I don't want to say a blip on the radar, but this is not what journalism has to be. And there are enough conscientious people in this field who are working very hard to bring it back to a point where we can count on it and respect it. So it's not over yet, and don't think that because it's happening right now that it's going to be that way forever. And of course, with the new training of the journalists that Yolanda and I are promoting in the new world, it'll be less likely to happen. And
it's interesting because we need to look at where the accusations are coming from, where the hostility is coming from, and realize that a lot of it is projection of one's own negative behaviors and thoughts and beliefs onto the other. We saw that in the 2016 election. We're seeing it now. And we have to distinguish. I think it should be essential that a president of the United States hold official news conferences with all the news media present, able to ask the pointed questions that are now rejected, just blown away, don't answer them. And you don't hold news conferences with a helicopter whirring, in the distance, and you can't hear what's being said. And you don't make news through tweets. That's not acceptable. In my world as a journalist, we deserve to have presidential, news conferences where there can be questions fired and questions answered.
But I think it's so fascinating that President Trump agreed to have Bob Woodward interview him, knowing what a thorough journalist he was, and knowing that he gave no cover, take no prisoners kind of journalism, where he really would go and he recorded everything. He asked all these questions, and maybe President Trump didn't like what was written about him in the book, but what you do get a sense of is that his ultimate respect for the journalists who asked him the questions. And that, I think, is important information. I asked earlier, who do we have like Walter Cronkite? I would say, I think Woodward comes very close to the ideal of the scrupulous journalist, and the one who's willing to, even in the book itself, there are places where he could condemn President Trump, but he couldn't find enough information to do that, and he just left it open. And even that alone shows that he was trying to be dispassionate and objective, and I value that enormously.
Mm-hmm. So another of our viewers has asked, how do you think the corporate ownership of media outlets has affected the ability of the media to bring truth and objectivity to the people?
Very serious problem. It's like big pharma in media. I mean, that's basically what you have. You have people controlling the news that's going to be published and censoring what is not pleasant to their ears. And I have to say, I'm going to give you a personal example now, because these personal examples for me tend to hit home more than what I read about. I was put in jail on Facebook because I attempted to publish an article that was already an existing article. I just wanted to repost it, in which it said that certain doctors believe that wearing a mask for people who are challenged, who have difficulty breathing, is harmful. And when I tried to post that article, immediately there was like a bell chime, and this announcement jumped up, and it said, our fact checkers say that what you're about to post is untrue. And so we're just advising you that if you persist in publishing this kind of information, your distribution will be greatly limited. And then, even though I didn't post the article because I suddenly realized that I was being censored, right? I was still, none of my 4,000 people that get my postings and that very often respond and make comments for the next 2 weeks, nothing. And so I knew that I had been censored by one of these big mega media sources, because Facebook is that. So that was my personal experience. And it was, I would say it was pretty sobering when it happened to me, because I realized then I had lost connection with more than 4,000 people who I regularly contribute information to.
What's interesting about that particular case where, well, if it could harm me if I have to wear a mask, then you stay indoors, or you don't go out in public where you're going to affect anybody else or anybody else can affect you, that your freedom ends where mine begins, and vice versa. That's John Stuart Mill. And I think that's something that we're forgetting about. How do we look at the whole group, not just BBB? And how do we protect not only ourselves, but consider protecting others, and looking at it as a whole of our community that we're trying to protect. And in those states where we've done that, with some diligence, the number of COVID has been reversed. And in places where it hasn't happened, it's escalated. And so we have to look at the science. And again, we have to look at basic, intelligent John Stuart Mill.
And you know what? I would like to ask the person who phrased that question what that person thinks. What do you do when you know the media is being controlled mainly by 5 news sources? What does that person do?
Well, and that's new on, I think you were talking about Facebook. That's new that they've started censoring. So that we're entering a new phase where Facebook's deciding what should and should not be censored. So this is a whole new phase of the social media world, which was already, in my opinion anyway, could be dangerous.
And Laura, not only that, but Snopes used to be a place where you could go to check facts, and now they've uncovered that that's not a reliable place either. That you may not get the truth about something, and what you originally thought was true may be true, even though the Snopes says it isn't. So again, you say, well, now what? Who do we go to next?
During the election cycle, the last election, they were doing some really good fact checking quickly, turn around. And I think we need to see some of that. And I don't know how they're going to handle that during the debate, because there are people who lie every couple of seconds. So it really has to be. We really do desperately need fact checking, and the public has to begin to look at what some of the, which facts are true and what statements are lies. And there's a lot of lying going on. So it takes great discernment on our parts, and we have to depend that as the public. We've got a major issue coming up in terms of the attempt to storm barrel an appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court before the November election. And the purpose of doing that is to stack the deck to allow the Supreme Court to take apart the Affordable Care Act. And so there are strategies that are at work here. We have to look, beyond what seems to be the obvious. And by right, that decision for the next Supreme Court replacement should be made by the new president. That's constitutional.
So the next question we have here is about world news. And it is the only place I can find world news is BBC and Democracy Now! The Economist is another good international source. Can you offer any others? And I've noticed that myself, that it's very hard to get international news in the United States. I mean, you have to affirmatively seek it out.
Watch other stations. The Spanish language networks do a very good job of giving you global news, but it's in a different language. So I think we have to start looking at some of those other news carriers that do bridge, attempt to bridge the gap, but sometimes requires having to speak a different language.
Well, I was going to comment on that. When I lived in Israel for almost 10 years, what I noticed immediately is that the Israelis were attuned to world news, whereas we were attuned to local news. And so they were actually, I would say they're addicted to news in Israel. And so every hour, they don't just have what's going on in the local communities or in the country itself. They always had, and then it also shows up in their movie theaters, because the plethora of films that were available from all over the world in Israel was much greater than in America, except for maybe in LA and New York, where you have access to a lot of foreign films. But the point was that their orientation wasn't so me about what's going on here, and the world news affected them greatly as well. What was going on with their neighbors was of great concern to them. Somehow, and Yolanda, you know this too from growing up here and being bilingual and coming from the Latina community. Americans have always wanted everybody else to learn English rather than learning a foreign language. And I remember that I was a celebrity among my friends because I spoke, 3 or 4 languages after my travels around the world. And they just thought that was so extraordinary. But in Europe, that's not extraordinary at all. People grew up learning 3, 4 languages, and it's just what they do because that's the way they know about the rest of the world. So,
well, we become insulated. We become insulated and isolated by being culturally narcissistic and by only thinking English only. And we need to expand that to understand other cultures, and we need to look at other cultures because we could learn from some of them. And there are some places where we talked about this during the healthcare debate, that there were many countries in the world that were way ahead of us in terms of protecting their people and providing healthcare coverage for their populations in Western nations. So why can't we? We're supposed to be the best of the richest. So we can expand out and we can learn and realize that we're not we can't just consume 40% of the world's, everything. We need to realize that we've got to share resources. We've got to think in terms of how do we protect the whole globe? How do we enhance everything for the larger population? How do we make a world that works for everyone, a world that works for everyone, not just our own country? And think in terms of the wholeness of the planet and the needs of the planet and of others, because we're all part of the same human family. We're all created by the same creator.
And Yolanda, that is so everything is connected, interconnected. It's not just individual issues on the hand. It's the fingers are connected at the wrist.
Yes.
And so what you mentioned now, when I think about immigration, it's not just about keeping our borders safe and making sure that people are here legally. If the policy of immigration is to keep out the brilliant people from around the world who want to come and build a life for themselves here, but because we're against immigration in principle, and so we deny ourselves the possibility of the brilliant minds and the talent of people from around the world. So you can't have, if you don't have, how should I say, an educated and civilized attitude towards immigration, you're going to end up being punitive without realizing how you're hurting internally the country itself.
And then to realize that economically, the food that we're eating every day is picked by usually immigrant labor in farm fields, in fact, and then meat processing factories, which process the foods, and somehow they get it to our tables. And so without this group of people coming in at all levels, higher educated, undereducated, those people then move their way up through through education and through time, to become entrepreneurs and business owners and entrepreneurs and college professors and doctors and teachers and nurses. And so there's a process of it all, but we have to appreciate that there are people who provide us with what we eat every day. And do we really want to close the borders for them?
You remember that film, A Day Without the Mexicans? That was a perfect example of how the foundation of our country in particular is based on, as you say, the hard labor of people the faceless, classless society that we don't think about ever, but that are making sure that we can get what we need. That's, I think though what I think, Yolanda, I think that's changing, because I think it's within 10 years, maybe less now, that more than 50% of the population will be made up of minorities. And as that's happening, and I know, that poses a threat for the many people in the white population who've become accustomed to being in charge and setting the rules and deciding what's going to happen. I think that these are challenging times for every group of people for different reasons. But I have confidence in our ability as creative, culturally creative and economically creative and scientifically creative and educationally creative, all the different sectors that are represented in this conference. I really believe that when enough creative people get together to solve a problem, they can. And the fact that this conference is also stretched out over several weeks' time, and people will be able to access later the information, I would really like to see this information shared widely and academically, not just for the general public. And that's something that I'm planning. I'm on the board of Oracle, and I appreciate so much everything that, if you don't mind, if I want to do a shout out now for the Peace Pentagon and the Oracle Institute and Laura George and all the fine people, Katie, all the fine people, and Stephen, and the people who have over the years been a bulwark for making this conference. This is not the first conference, and it's not the last one. And I just want to say that this is really an extraordinary conference. And I know as the days go by and more people share about the creative new ways to build a new world, that people will be reassured and not depressed about our current state of affairs, but they will see that so many things are possible for the future. So here.
Yeah, I
thank
saw
you.
so many things in just the opening night that can be packaged and delivered to decision makers, to the president, to the new president, to cabinet secretaries, to department heads, to the various divisions of subject areas that are being handled in this conference. And there are some practical solutions available. And there are ways to look at these things. And there are commissions that could be set up, like we had with the California Highway Patrol way back when, to explore the feasibility of putting women in the CHP, California Highway Patrol. And the then first-time Governor Brown selected a very broad-based stakeholder group. He didn't try to stack the deck one way or the other. And we had to look at the feasibility. And by God, we did it. And we made a better set of criteria than 5'6", 160 pounds and a penis. And it was a wonderful outcome that we had. And we developed the upper body strength for the women. And you're not going to beat somebody up with that. And so and the women actually diffused potential violence on the freeways and the highways of California. And it was a very exciting process because you really saw the tug and pull when you bring, like for the news story that was done on the Joshua Tree, you put those two or three or five groups together and you move back and forth. And it made me really respect the democratic process. And that's what we have to see. It's not my way or the highway, which is what's going on now. It's got to be this real looking at what is our outcome. And we have to stay with that. And it's great that you've had those ideas put forth very early on in the program of the conference.
Well, thank you so much. It has been a true pleasure to have Ruth Broyde Sharone and Yolanda Nava with us this evening. We're going to be taking a short break, and after the break, we're going to continue with Sector 2, which is communications and media. But now we're going to switch topics. This first segment has been about news broadcasting and the future of journalism. And the next segment with Michael Sean-Conaway is going to be about inspirational media making. How do we depict and inspire those who want to build the new world on a daily basis in their own town? So anyway, it's gonna be a slightly different focus, and we hope you'll join us at 7 o'clock. We'll see you then.